Thank you everyone for coming to, this is our second Lunch and Learn presentation. These presentations, discussion sessions are being organized by Jeff and I. I'm Sarah with Oregon Sea Grant. I think I know most of you guys here by now. If I don't, I run our marine renewable energy and community engagement program. So one of the things that we've been doing are putting on these sessions to provide some extra discussion and education to help with the Oregon offshore wind energy roadmap. So we're really excited today to have Travis Douville here from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and he's going to talk to us about this report that was just published about offshore wind transmission planning on the West Coast. So we'll hear a presentation from Travis, and then we'll have the second half of the meeting to ask questions and discuss how some of these findings could relate to what we're thinking about in the roadmap. Jeff, is there anything you want to add to that? I think most people here, I recognize most names from the roadmap roundtable. There might be a couple other people here who aren't on the roundtable.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to see a lot of people here today because this is a really important piece of the puzzle. I think those of you who've been participating in the Offshore Wind Roadmap Roundtable discussions maybe realize, like I do, just how complex that side of the equation is. But then when you try to couple it with the complex system that is our energy grid and our power systems, it just compounds and it's really hard to hold it all in your brain when we're trying to think about what our possible paths forward are and what actions we should be focusing on in the near term for energy resiliency of the state and the coast, whether it involves turbines in the future or not. So I'm really happy, Travis, that you're here. Looking forward to the discussion that comes, and I hope that we all learn a little something new. So
Yeah.
let's get going.
Thanks. And by the way, this presentation is being recorded. We'll post this on our YouTube as a resource. I'll be monitoring the chat, so if anyone has any tech issues, just send a chat, let me know. And try to, we'll hold our questions for the discussion after the presentation, but if you have anything on your mind, you want to put it in the chat to save for discussion, feel free to do that. And Travis, thank you so much again for joining us, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thanks, Jeff, for the opening remarks. This will be, I think, pretty quick, and then hopefully I'm glad that there will be an opportunity for some Q&A here. I have to say before I start that because I work for a national laboratory on behest of the Department of Energy, I have to stick to the work that was published today. And the presentation today will be about the work that was published in January. But this actually, we titled this more broadly around offshore wind transmission planning. My part of this was the offshore wind transmission study, the West Coast offshore wind transmission study. But there was also a convening that happened and that resulted in an action plan which sought to identify actionable steps, tangible steps that could be taken by planners, state entities to help facilitate offshore wind transmission. We did a similar exercise on the Atlantic coast, so it's a pretty it's a kind of, I would say, an exercised strategy to use this sort of convening along with an analysis, the two efforts complementing each other in one domain, in one context. And then we've done that, so first in the Atlantic, now West Coast, and then the thought is to continue that work in the Gulf. So, and then maybe eventually other places as well as we pursue this resource. But this work that I'm going to talk about today, I'm just one of many people. There are 2 national laboratories involved. There were 60 different researchers directly contributing to the work you'll see today, 2 Department of Energy offices, 2 federal departments, and it took 2 years, a lot of 2s there. So 2 years of work, which culminated in January. So this started in May of 2023. Actually, feels like a lifetime ago. But that's really the study on top. And then this action plan ran for most of that time. It started a little bit later, also culminated in a report that went out in January. But the key gaps, we started with a gaps literature review and gaps analysis in early 2023 before we kicked off the study, and we used that to architect the study. So we looked at the things that hadn't been done. There had been done some work by myself and others in this space, but no one had really done a full-blown co-optimization of generation and transmission capacity, especially across the distances of the entire US West Coast. No one had really done a very in-depth geospatial analysis that spanned not just Oregon's coastline, but also Washington and California's. And then, although we had started to see, and I would actually attribute this idea of pathways, you'll hear me say that word numerous times today. We started to see that in some transmission planning exercises, particularly out of California. That really hadn't found its way into the literature and into the academic work. There wasn't a really thorough coverage, I would say, of reliability and resilience of the transmission system, with offshore wind included in the work that had been done, and then community perspectives hadn't been fully folded into the work. And some of that continues today. So there is a bit of this work. What I'll be speaking about today is what was published, but there is some follow-on work that was part of this effort and continuing along the lines of community values and community benefits. And that continues to, Katie Arkema is one of our leaders in that subject matter. And she was in the majority of this effort, and then continues to complete that work now. Then the action plan was structured around this graphic, the lower left. You can see these 5 different domains: planning and operations, partnerships, tribal opportunities and support, technology, and then environmental review, siting, and permitting. There were 12 different workshops. One of the great things about working with DOE and for DOE, we joke about the DOE phone or the bat phone. It's kind of like when you ask for people to come and share thoughts or participate in a session, it's just so great. It really fills your heart with hope when people want to participate in those forums. And so the participation was robust here. I wasn't directly on this team, but our work on the study was used as part of the convening and informed the recommendation, these 56 recommendations that came out of this work. And there were an additional 20 that are applicable from the first time we did this in the Atlantic. As you might imagine, if we're talking about high voltage direct current technologies in the marine environment, some of those recommendations may very well apply on the West Coast as well. And so that's what those 20 pertain to, those sort of portable topics. So let's take a minute here on the kind of the design of experiment. And the idea here in this study was to consider the full Western interconnection, first of all. So I'm not sure how many grid people I'm talking to today. So we have an Eastern interconnection, we have a Western interconnection, we have ERCOT. Those are the 3 major subdivisions of the continental United States electricity supply and transmission network. And so obviously we're part of the Western interconnection. These West Coast states, in this context, the context of the study was placed within that of the Western interconnection. And that means that we consider how offshore wind might influence the whole Western interconnection. And that's another piece of this that really hadn't been fully probed. Oftentimes folks will take one part of that out, and I did a grid integration study in Oregon, although that did model the full Western interconnection back in 2020. It didn't build out the full Western interconnection to the way it might mature from 2035 to 2050. And that's really important. That context is really important because the type of transmission that may evolve to serve other needs could definitely impact the case or what the benefits or costs may be from bringing electrons off the ocean through offshore wind turbines into the coastal networks that are typically less developed. And similarly through 2050. I mean, in 2050, we modeled completely clean systems, clean in the sense there was no carbon associated with the generation mix. In the 2050 system, there were significant reductions in carbon in the 2035 system as well, closer to 90%. But we model these 5 different, what we call topology sets. And there's some kind of simplified cartoons here. But the idea is in 2035, we're just getting started really at that point, although just getting started means 15 gigawatts. So you might think that, we'll definitely take baby steps before we get there. But if, it's time intensive to build these systems, but we want to try to build a couple different looks into the future so that we can see if we identify solutions to get us maybe to 2035, how helpful are those to 2050? Thinking that a lot of the change happens from potentially, from 2035 to 2050. So that's why we frame those 2 sort of bookends here on the screen. And then if we just look at 2035 for a moment, we considered a world in which perhaps there is a use of multiple points of interconnection. So multiple, each of these has multiple, but many more, 9 different points of interconnection in the distributed case, where we're interconnecting, relatively, we're distributing the power flow across 9 different points, as opposed to the concentrated case, which you might very well pursue that as a strategy. You might say, gosh, there are, a few POIs on the coast right now that have a lot of capacity. I mean, some of the BOEM activity and the industry pursuit of the opportunity already indicates that. So, this is Diablo Canyon, is a place where, like, gosh, that seems like a really great place to interconnect. There's a lot of, great transmission right into that point. It's no coincidence that there's a lease area near there, and there certainly is a need for that power there. There are other places along there are 4 other places that are certainly, kind of high priority, or look like they're that kind of the juiciest ones to interconnect offshore wind. But every time you interconnect a significant amount of offshore wind or any type of generation through one point of interconnection, you're going to incur some upgrades that are required at that location. And that always happens at every POI. But the theory here was, gosh, I wonder how much more it's going to cost, how much more the upgrades will need to be to maintain reliability in a system in which we only use 5 POIs in 2035 versus 9 of them to interconnect the same 15 gigawatts. The 15 gigawatts was the product of a capacity expansion optimization that resolved a least cost generation and mix throughout the whole WEC. And the same is true in 2050. We ran a similar optimization, and we came up with the need for 33 gigawatts of offshore wind. So that's one of the findings right away, is that we see a need for 15 and 35 and 33 and 50. And then where the study, I think, gets even more interesting is in 2050, we consider these different, potential plausible futures. I want to just remind folks that these are just plausible futures. They're not necessarily the optimum. Sometimes people see the Department of Energy study and they think, oh, this is what it has to look like. That's not true. There are many factors at play here. What we try to come up with is, an optimization approach that reveals some plausible topology sets, and then we do some geospatial analysis, which I'll show you shortly, which indicates what kinds of routes could be supported to bring this power flow to these points of interconnection. But in 2050, first we have a radial case. So in this radial case, both the 2035s are radial. When I say radial, we're going from one generation plant in the water offshore through a single intertie, could be a set of transmission lines, but they're going one way. They're going from that wind plant and they're going to the point of interconnection. Now that point of interconnection could be fed by other wind plants, but all the flow is from left to right, from the water, the wind turbines in the ocean to the points of interconnection onshore. That is the way the industry is pursuing offshore wind today in most contexts, and has historically pursued it. And the things you've maybe been tracking on the projects that are existing still on the Atlantic coast, they have these radial interconnections, and that's not a surprise. That's how I'm sure the first projects on the West Coast will go. The opportunity from the transmission space is when we start coordinating those assets. We start coordinating the transmission, taking advantage of bidirectional flows, potentially moving power from different wind power plants in the ocean to a POI based on availability of the resource, costs of energy at any given POI. And so you get varying degrees of that in the intra-regional, so within regions, particularly the Northwest, and then California in the middle topology set, and then finally the inter-regional case, which would require the most coordination. So we'll talk about these, and I'll show you what these look like. But importantly, the most important thing on this chart, I think, are the arrows. And the arrows are to tell you that there are 6 different ways to go from those two 2035s to the 3 different 2050s. And we like to think of the distributed in 2035, where you're kind of peanut buttering out your power flow over 9 different points of interconnection that have potential in 2035. Those are all through radial feeds, 15 gigawatts. To a 2050, what we consider to be a counterfactual, which would be if we didn't do any planning or didn't coordinate or encourage the industry to coordinate in any way, we could end up in a 2050 where 33 gigawatts are radially interconnected. And I think you can probably sense what I'm foreshadowing, which is that probably is not a very that's certainly not an optimal future in which we have many more miles of transmission and we have only one way to move the power. And so you're left with few options for the way to cut the cost of electricity and reduce and offset carbon emissions. So everything we will do from here on out is referencing pathways 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to that pathway 1 is our kind of counterfactual. If nothing's done, we'd end up with 1 is the thought. Okay, keep moving here, folks. So this is what those cartoons look like when we put them on what we call our subway style maps. So just like you're taking the subway, you're thinking about which stop to get off of at. The stop you're getting off at is a point of interconnection on these maps. Of course, the lines, the green and there is a blue line here in one of them, 2 of them, 3 of them, 4 of them, they're all there. And then the orange lines are different types of transmission. So we have primarily high voltage alternating current transmission lines, which typically carry less power per given line and don't have as much control over them. That's how much of the system, most of the system has historically been built with high voltage alternating current lines. I would consider those to be lower cost, more mature technology today. And then high voltage direct current lines, which we do have some experience with, particularly in the Western interconnection, but not a lot of experience offshore. And although there is an HVDC line in San Francisco, coming from the Inner Bay to Potrero substation, that one is in the water. It is trenched. It's in relatively shallow water, and it doesn't carry as much power as these. So these are high capacity, 525 kV high voltage direct current transmission lines, and substations associated with those and breakers associated with those, which will require some technology development, particularly in the waters that we have off the West Coast, which are quite deep. These would be some of the deepest installations of HVDC in the world. So you can see from left to right, kind of mixed up the order on you here. Sorry about that. But the radial concentrators on the far left, you can see the 5 different points of interconnection that I was referring to. So pretty significant power flows into Diablo Canyon from the south part of the map up to Collinsville. It's another 4 gigawatts. Humboldt really is kind of the landing point for cables. And then part of the California ISO transmission plan is to build this line, significant link between Humboldt and a new Fern Road substation. So between those two, we model 4,000 megawatts going there, and then another 2,000 megawatts into Fairview in Oregon. That's near Coos Bay. So then when we think about going to the distributed case, we put a little less into Fairview, you'll see, and maybe we go down to Del Norte, which is near Crescent City, and not far from Brookings. So instead of that 2,000 megawatts going into Fairview, you get 1,000 in Coos Bay, roughly, and 1,000 near Brookings or Crescent City. And then a little less into Fern, but you can see how we're tapping into a few more points of interconnection, a little bit less power into each one of those. Then in the right block on the screen here, we get into the 2050 set where we have 33,000 megawatts of offshore wind. It's a great deal, and the way we do that is through the radial on the left set. That's the counterfactual You can see how many more POIs. So we go to 13 POIs now. You can see how the power flows are significant, almost 6,000 megawatts into Collinsville in the Bay Area. Diablo Canyon stays in all of these at 5,000 megawatts. By 2050, I'll call out that we've retired Diablo Canyon nuclear facility at this point. That wasn't the case in 2035 in these models. But still, Diablo Canyon sees this 5,000 megawatts throughout. And then if we think about the intra-regional case, what we start to see is some coordination onshore of some of the HVDC lines, particularly in California. So you'll see multiple lines coming into one POI, and that POI being linked onshore over land to other POIs. So this is where you start to see the avenues for value start to emerge, in which you're coordinating the flows across entry points into the transmission system. Up here in Oregon, and kind of right over the Oregon-California border, we do also model an AC intra-regional link. Now, technically, I am using the term intra-regional somewhat loosely here. From a transmission perspective, we're going across Bonneville and Pacific Core West footprints here. You could argue that's interregional, but I'm kind of thinking it as I think what everyone would acknowledge is that there's sort of is a northern kind of coast, and there's California, and really Crescent City is close enough, and a lot of the power into Crescent City would feed Grants Pass and areas like that. So we do consider that to be within the Pacific Northwest region, that green link, and then this kind of the oranger links, and this multi-terminal HVDC to be within California, within the CAISO footprint, so California ISO footprint. Then in the interregional case, you get full connectivity between the Northwest and California, and you can see we end up with less connectivity on land. That's another intentional decision, but to look at more of that connectivity into water. Could there be some benefits to having this transmission not be in forested areas that are prone to wildfire, for example? That's something that we looked at. And then we also link up between, we have a DC to AC kind of meetup point here just south of Crescent City, but there is a way to flow power all the way from Coos Bay down into San Francisco in this build. All right, so back to the geospatial analysis. I want to acknowledge BOEM, and I know there's some Jeff and others. I don't know how many of you are from the Department of Land Conservation and Development, but for you folks, 25 GIS layers is nothing, but for us, I would say that's significant for the work we do typically when we think of geospatial analysis. So keep in mind that there would always be more refined analysis needed. This is maybe conceptual in some ways. We do try to account for particularly, and this is all in the report, the different layers that we used. Certainly bathymetry, right? We don't really want to run anything beyond 1,300 meters water depth. That tends to be a bit of a kind of a rule of thumb, a guiding boundary, if you will. We keep in mind, and some things you can see in the darker colors here in offshore particularly, are things like the Coast Guard pack pars fairways. There is pure exclusions are in white, so there's a DoD usage off of Coos Bay that we don't want to place any transmission or generation in that area. And then there are these underwater canyons, these kind of fingers here. A lot of these very deep canyons, which are problematic, particularly for transmission lines, and there can be near seafloor turbidity flows, which are movement of the seafloor that can, think of like underwater landslides that can really damage cables, and damaging cables at these depths would be catastrophic. I mean, it'd be very difficult to repair these cables this far out. So we try to avoid those canyons, and actually you'll see they're excluded, so they're white. So we completely avoid those canyons, and we try to limit the intrusion to marine protected areas along the West Coast. There are several of those, some of them north of San Francisco, and there's a new, I actually forgot the name of it. I want to say Chumash, I'm not sure that's the name of it. It's been a while now, down near, closer to San Luis Obispo. And then there's even usual and custom fishing grounds up here in the north end of the Washington coast off the Atlantic Peninsula. That's also an exclusion. So there are a variety of things that we incorporate, and there's some more DoD exclusions down south. And what we find is, and then we marry this with where the resource is strong. And what we find is that 30 gigawatts is about the limit. I mean, we modeled 33, but approximately the 33 gigawatts of offshore wind could be deployed across the West Coast in the places that are economically favorable, the places that are maybe in the money or would be chosen by the capacity expansion model as part of the least cost mix. After you tried to go beyond 30 gigawatts, you are forced with either the choice to go into deeper water, which drives up costs of the energy, because now you need longer mooring lines, you need the installation and maintenance costs grow, it becomes more complex. Or you've got to go to the north, really, not the south. There's not much room to work with in the south. There are a lot of constraints there. The water gets quite deep pretty quickly, as you can see from this map. That's part of the exclusions on the far left. There's more DoD activity down there. So the wind resource drops off. So really, you end up going north, and so that would push you more closer to, maybe north of Coos Bay, where the resource again is not as good, and that's a finding. That's a finding to just know that 30 gigawatts is, with the technology we have today, that would be a bit of a cap. And you can see this is the first time I've shown you one of the actual maps that kind of shows you where the places would be for the generators to lie in the ocean, and then how the routing optimization picks locations for transmission lines to be in the ocean, and then even on land, all the way into the points of interconnection that are chosen. All right, so this is probably 9 months of work in a slide here, but so it's high level. I'm happy to take questions if you folks have some. Trying to share with you what's actionable and useful. The first thing is that these upper left diagrams are attempting to indicate that we've modeled at nodal resolution. And when I use that term nodal, there's nodal and zonal scales in this world of transmission system analysis. And when we say nodal, we are referring to, it is all bulk electricity system, but we're thinking about individual power plants. So we've modeled, and that's what these circles are on the screen here. So of various types. This is an offshore wind study, but we modeled a great deal of PV plants all over the Western Connection. And you've got PV plants in Colorado here that are modeled, and of course Arizona, New Mexico. And you have we've modeled in 2050 in particular. How do we have a completely clean system? We modeled hydrogen-fed combustion turbines, so they're not releasing carbon as a byproduct, but they are dispatchable in that sense, and if you look closely, you'll see they're all over the place. So there's a lot of green on this map. And then the other thing I'd say is that we've modeled a great deal of transmission. And some of those transmission projects are those that are in flight today. And you may have heard of some of these. I mean, we haven't had a great track record of successfully completing these in the West, although long distance transmission is something that we have in our history. And it's something that has been a success story in the Western Interconnection for the better part of 6 decades, 5-6 decades, starting with the Pacific DC intertie. Boardman Hemingway, 10 West Link, these are all names of transmission lines that are in late stage development, fairly mature. We modeled those directly. And then we also added additional lines that were needed by this build that we put in place. That build itself includes an additional 325 gigawatts from 2035 to 2050 to get to a clean system. You'll also see, by clean, I'm using clean synonymous with decarbonization, and I should be careful with that. That's kind of a general term, but to remove carbon from the generation mix, we have to add that many gigawatts. And we also, you can see, retire a bit of the kind of natural gas fed combustion turbines and combined cycle turbines. So that's all done on the production cost model side, and we model dispatch of all these things, the use of the transmission, the selection of different power plants to meet a load which we've inflated from today all the way through 2050. And we've considered, the change in the nature of that load, but this was pre-AI, the study. So there wasn't a lot of AI load growth, but which is what everyone's talking about now. There was, in this study, consideration of electrification of transport, electrification of building, heating, and cooling. So there's a significant amount of load growth assumed in this study, and we're considering how this mix of resources and transmission assets can help to meet that load growth. So once we solve for that, and we have at every hour of the year a dispatch for how the system will function, then we run detailed power flow analysis, and there's a set of NERC criteria which govern how reliability is verified and assured. And we model the failure of individual components per those NERC criteria, and then identify reinforcements to the primarily onshore system that are necessary to be able to serve power reliably given this build. Now, one thing I'm going to emphasize here is that 33 gigawatts of offshore wind is a lot of offshore wind. 33 gigawatts out of 300 gigawatts is something you can barely see in this stack. So it really is a challenge to focus on what the offshore wind contribution is here. Many of these upgrades are required based on this huge change to the onshore system that we've modeled. We are interested in seeing how offshore wind participates in that transition. How does it facilitate things? And I think it's unrealistic to consider a world in which you develop much offshore wind, but you don't develop anything else. And that's been kind of a flaw of the other studies. So we targeted that. All right, and then here are the key economic findings on this chart. So what we find is that, and you'll remember that chart where I said we're going to compare everything to pathway 1. Pathway 1 is that 2035 distributed to 2050 radial counterfactual. So if we just do purely radial transmission in 2035 and in 2050, that's what we're comparing every other pathway to. Now remember, those radial builds, this reference case that's mentioned again in the title here, that was the result of a least cost optimization. So our models are telling us that is valuable in and of itself. So we're asking ourselves, how much better can we do than that? And through coordinating transmission, and what we find is, well, quite a bit better. There's quite a bit of value here. And the main source of that value are these green bars. So that's a fuel offset cost. So the idea is that this isn't necessarily because this transmission is bringing offshore wind generated electrons to shore, and that's what's cutting all the costs. That's part of it. I mean, it's definitely offsetting fuel that way, but the main benefit is adding more transmission to enable the shifting of lower cost generation from places that, well, in lower cost regions, particularly maybe in the Northwest, maybe even inland a bit, to get those down to high cost regions, and thereby offset higher cost generation in places like California, Southern California in particular. This is the majority of the benefit stack is due to that. Now, of course, building these transmission systems is extremely expensive, particularly offshore. We've conservatively, we believe, modeled these costs for putting this stuff in very deep water. There's some small changes in imports from Canada here that are modeled. It's really a detail and not really worth getting into. It's not a significant part of the story. The other piece is this increased availability. And what I'll say about that is, this is the ability, if one sees a failure on one of the interties from offshore to a point of interconnection at the coast, to be able to redispatch power around. And this could happen onshore as well. We only modeled this for the offshore backbone, but the idea that that's why you only see it in the interregional cases. But the ability to redispatch power, reroute power, is something that's a potential attribute and offering from grid forming high voltage direct current systems, particularly multi-terminal high voltage direct current systems. And then what I'll say is, the last thing here about the plot itself, there's really not much of a difference between the reference pathway and going from the concentrated 2035 to that same 2050 radial counterfactual. So what does this tell us? You can take different strategies in 2035 without really restricting long-term benefits. So you can, maybe there are good reasons to lump power into just a few points of interconnection. In our case, it's 5. Maybe there are reasons that might encourage planners to think about distributing power and then potentially distributing the power benefit to more communities. For example, it doesn't really penalize the 2050 future. There's really no cost of picking one of those over the other. So we speculate that there could be, if done properly, maybe improved community benefit potential by distributing interconnections, or the reverse could be true. And then on the resource adequacy piece, this is a key topic now. What we found is that resource adequacy value of the turbines, the contributions in terms of capacity was quite high, and we're not the first study to find that. But what was surprising, and this was the first study to show this, the transmission system itself does not provide a capacity benefit. And we were surprised by that. We thought that once we made connections between regions and were able to move power and serve non-coincident peaks with a diversity of generators, that maybe we would see a capacity contribution, and we were not able to quantify that. So that's something important to note as well. Okay, just a couple more slides. So back to this action plan. We assumed a ton of high voltage direct current transmission. All those orange lines on the charts that I showed you assume that we can develop high voltage direct current transmission at scale in places we've never developed it before, and that we can coordinate the operations of these systems which are likely owned by multiple entities with perhaps unaligned objectives in all cases. So how does that future, how could that come to be? The action plan had something to say about this. There's need for equipment and technology standardization. We have numerous recommendations from these 2 documents which call out that type of standardization. And I'll point to near and dear to my heart, a multi-terminal high voltage direct current test and certification center. The UK has something like this. I think the United States context is different. We have nuances around how we plan transmission systems that are multi-layered, and I think it would be helpful to have our own focus on that. Although we are learning quite a bit from Europe, and in particular the 2 gigawatt program. If you care to read about that later, or if you have any questions about that, that is something that Europe is taking the lead on, particularly Germany. And a lot of those systems could play here if we adjusted some things in the way we plan, and particularly around contingency reserves. Then reliability standards. This has to do with some clarifications from NERC on how these HVDC bipoles could be trenched and what would the spacing be required in terms of ensuring system reliability. These are carrying a lot of power, so we have to think about if you lose one of those poles, or if you lost the whole bipole, that's 2 gigawatts of power that you could lose, in an instant. So that would be a shift from the way we plan the system today. And then of course R&D and supply chain work to make sure that this stuff could actually come to fruition. So if there's one thought I leave you with, it would be the importance of considering these pathways. The idea that planners they can't just, there can be analysis paralysis, right? Planners can't they don't have the luxury of just writing a study like me, or sitting on their hands and not executing plans, making plans that are actionable. They have to take a step now. We need to take a step now to meet our current and emerging loads. And there are various constraints into how we do that, of course, that we must consider. But we also have to think about the long term. And the lesson from the UK in particular was loud and clear. Don't just go out there and do radial lines. I mean, you're going to be left with a lot of a lot of infrastructure potentially in the ocean, which poses a cost. And you're also, from a transmission perspective, you're going to really constrain the benefits that one could see from an opportunity like this. So we have to kind of do two things at once. We have to think about steps we can take now, and now for us meant, by 2035, and then steps that may be conducive to and how those steps may be conducive to a long-term future, and how one can go from 2035 to 2050. So we sort of have to take two views simultaneously as we take these steps. And I think the CAISO has done a really good job of that. There are multiple ways to get there. We showed you 6. There could be many more. These are plausible builds, but we think it's important to think about, the optionality and the ability of the fungibility of pathways to near and long-term benefits. When we do this work, but we also think this is not an offshore wind specific encouragement. We think this is true of building out transmission and generation footprints in all contexts. But I'm happy to take your questions, and that's all I have prepared, Sarah.
Thank you. That was really great. That made me realize that I have a lot to learn about transmission systems. Delia wrote in the chat, possibly a clarifying question. What do you mean by contingency reserves?
Oh, yeah. So basically, yeah, these upgrades. So when a line, so there is, trying to answer this succinctly, there is a requirement that any bulk transmission asset, generation or transmission line, if it fails, there has to be an ability to maintain supply to load. There has to be an ability of the transmission system and the electricity system to meet loads under those conditions. So there are reserves in place. What that means is either spinning or non-spinning resources which are ready to go in case we lose a generator or we lose a line. There are also ways to redispatch around failed assets and try to limit loss of load. So planners have to consider contingencies. So the failure of individual pieces of equipment, and there also are redundant or N-1, they call it N-1 -1. So that would be more than one loss of a critical asset, not the same asset, but you lose one major line and then you lose maybe another line next to it, or somewhere else. Planners have a systematic way they comb through these potential failures, and then they have a set of reserves that are in place to be able to handle those potential drops, but preserve system frequency, voltage, and ultimately serve load. Offshore, what I was referring to is there is a guidance. The planners will accept a certain size of loss. They call it a single source contingency limit. They'll say, we can plan our system so that we can handle, say, 1,200 megawatts of power to be lost at any given time. So we have reserve fleets ready to be able to handle that, and that's happening. I mean, the power grid is like a bunch of spinning plates, so that's happening at every instant. Like right now, there are reserves that are ready for something to happen on the power system, and some of them are spinning; they're ready to go like immediately. So that's what I'm referring to. And if one wanted to have some of these higher capacity lines that take a ton of power through one small corridor, that does raise a question about that reserve fleet, and is it worth it for us to grow that reserve fleet so that we can handle such a large loss of power at once, which would thereby unlock the benefits of being able to move so much power through a smaller corridor and into individual points of interconnection. So there's a cost benefit there. There are some benefits associated with larger interconnections, but there is a risk of losing that much power at any one time, which would have to be planned for and paid for across the system.
Yeah. Another question just came into the chat, but did anyone have a question on video here? let's see. Oh yeah. Gina asked if the study incorporated considerations related to offshore military operations and how that could restrict these scenarios, which you did mention before. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And there's more of this in the report, but and we did work closely with Kim Preacher with the Northwest DoD, and this, and I'll just call out this one location specifically, again off Coos Bay, that was fully excluded from the work. And then there are also exclusions considered down in Southern California. Many of them are in the deeper water, so you won't see, like, you'll see some exclusions here, these white areas. But again, if we get past, I think the cutoff on this plot might have been, don't quote me, it might have been 3,000 meters, or yeah, I can't remember now, sorry, but I think it's 3,000 meters, and some of those exclusions are not that deep. So you can imagine what happens out there. But in general, it becomes less of an issue because the resource drops. The resource really climbs. If folks have seen the maps, like, they're really, the simple way to think about it is the offshore wind resources is blowing the hardest at the Oregon California border. Approximately.
So yeah, I had a quick question. I guess more of a clarification. In the non-radial scenario where you have a two-way transfer of electrons, you're basically creating an extension of the grid that goes offshore. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then from that last finding you shared that said, I was trying to understand if that finding, that provides no incremental capacity, does that mean that, like, having the extension of that grid doesn't really add much to our West Coast grid, or am I interpreting?
Yeah, this is a confusing, it's a hard one to, it's difficult to distinguish capacity from the other benefits. The green bar here is due to the ability to move power up and down. So it's certainly true that one can offset costs of higher, more expensive generation down near Diablo Canyon by using this offshore transmission. And so it does serve capacity in that way. But what I mean is, in times of system stress, when we think about resource adequacy, what we really mean, typically what we mean on the West Coast, and certainly in California, are summer evenings. And you're probably not surprised by that, right? Because that's when the solar plants are winding down and the loads are climbing. This is the duck curve, the classic duck curve problem. Those late summer evenings, and we're talking July, September, where it's still relatively hot and your AC loads are significant at night. Those are dominating the research. Those dominated, past tense work that's been published. Those dominated the resource adequacy events that we identified. So these are the times of peak system stress when the system is most likely to be short on resources. And so that's when I say resource adequacy, we're checking those times in particular because we need resources that can show up and generate and provide and meet load in those hours. And offshore wind is great for that. Offshore wind on the West Coast does produce power in those times repeatedly and consistently, and in our model. So we think that actually is a strength of offshore wind. But the transmission itself, when I go from a radial to a interregional transmission, I don't see a benefit to the transmission component alone. And that would be coming from non-offshore wind resources, using that transmission to move power to meet that peak. So for example, in those late summer evenings, loads in the Pacific Northwest aren't, through the roof. Those aren't our, like, system stress points. So you would think extra capacity could use that transmission and serve, say, loads in California that are very high, maybe the highest of the year in those summer evenings. What we see is that transmission didn't really add much to that, which was surprising. Apparently there's enough transmission. And the real reason why is that there's enough transmission onshore to do that already. So adding this offshore, fairly expensive offshore transmission didn't really contribute to that benefit. Whereas on the other studies, my past work where I didn't build out a copper plate practically of the Western interconnection with so much transmission, so much generation, I did see significant value to. So it's sort of a hedge. Like if we can't build out, so this goes outside of the study to past published work. It's still all published, but I will say that if we cannot build out the land-based system to the extent that some of what we've modeled and what people are thinking is possible, then offshore wind transmission could provide a hedge. It could be an alternative. It's hard for me to see a world in which we're able to do offshore but not onshore, but then again, maybe not. There are many objections to onshore transmission as well. On the Atlantic coast, last thing I'll say, Sarah, is on the Atlantic coast, this was a huge source of the value, was the resource adequacy contribution, not from offshore wind, but from the transmission that was really put in place to bring offshore wind to shore, but it could be used by other things in times of system stress.
Got it. Thank you. Jeff, I see, I think your hand was up first. Another question came in the chat. I don't know, Jeff, was your question on the same topic?
I have a feeling that Caitlin's question can be answered relatively quickly, so it seems like
Yeah.
is it this or is it that?
Yeah, we didn't explicitly model storage at the points of interconnection assumed here in this study. There is energy storage throughout the Western interconnection that's being used for arbitrage, basically. So kind of, playing the price game. But everything that I'm showing was, fed directly through the POIs at different times of year. We tried to have enough transmission that for all resources, not just offshore wind, we built enough in to minimize curtailment of any resource. So, and generally, what did that mean? Rule of thumb was 20%. We didn't want to see curtailment of any resource of greater than 20% of the energy in a year. And for offshore, it was less than that. It was less than 10%.
So to summarize it, it's the latter of what Caitlin was saying, that what we're talking about is it's just shuttling power. It's not storing it in the middle.
Well, it's nuanced. There are storage assets in onshore, but yes, we did not co-site storage assets where we were interconnecting. So that would be a strategy. One could consider putting a storage asset at every point of interconnection, and if there was some sort of congestion or something, you couldn't get the power out, you could just store it. You could store it for a while and then move it when the congestion cleared. We did not take that approach. Instead, we built out the transmission to be able to move the power all the way from the coast. So there's significant builds to the coastline for sure. And then but there still are stored. There's 10-hour storage in there. There's pump storage. There's a lot of storage to help with things like, significant price swings, and then to help with adequacy events, for example, to make sure that there's not a loss of load. That's one of the strategies in a completely clean system, for example, where you don't have as much dispatchable generation. But then again, we had a lot of combustible hydrogen. So yeah, I'd say it's mostly not a storage dominant study.
I wish we had another hour so that everyone on this call could just jump into the conversation and say what you've comprehended and what you've taken away from this. I'm really curious because this is on another level, man. This is so complex and detailed, and there's so much here. And I'm sure we're all kind of carrying something different away from it. I wanted to check my comprehension about what we're seeing on this slide. And I have about a dozen other questions, but I won't ask it. What I heard you say was that the green bar, which is like money saved, good stuff, right? That the reason that exists is because when power is really expensive in California during those summer afternoons and times like that, and they would otherwise be reaching for something truly expensive, if you have this connection between Oregon and California, plus we're generating something, that can then be brought down there at a lower cost to California.
Yes.
And so as a whole system, there is a savings, but that savings is concentrated in the California buyers of the power. Am I comprehending that correctly?
Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it.
Okay. So why is the green bar so big for intra-regional? When in the intra-regional model, it's really just one connection to that Del Norte station right over the border that you said supplies Crescent City and like Grants Pass. Can you explain to me
Yeah.
why there's so much savings under that model?
Yeah, so that one, there is also, I know it's not the backbone that you saw in the interregional case, so it's not as expansive. It doesn't go as far, and it doesn't link the Northwest. And I'm including I'm kind of including Southern Oregon in that, in northern, a little bit of Northern California, but it doesn't link that region with the California Independent System Operator territory. It doesn't do that, but it does shift power within CAISO very well, because it has multi-terminal DC networks onshore. So that is the reason. So there still is a way to shift. Now it's not as valuable, but we can still send power. You know, remember, there's an onshore. We're just showing the offshore build on this map, but there is an onshore system here, and there are generators up here, and there's transmission, of course, into Oregon. This allows one to potentially shift power into Alberta. It's just there's just more connectivity. So one can go from Fern Road down to Shasta. Shasta can go to Alberta. If you get into Collinsville, which is East Bay, then you can get into the Bay. You can get into San Francisco. You can, but most of that saving is just going to be up here in the sort of like central to north coast region, and a lot less, further south. But actually, when you think about like the intra-regional case, I mean, yeah, it's true. There's a little bit more connectivity to move power, like all the way. I think of all the hydro reserves up in Oregon. Now we have transmission that gets power down there, but in 2050 we have even more. Like you think of the generation you have now, you have way more generation in this 2050, way more. And there's, you saw it, 300 gigawatts, right? So it's more than a doubling, and you have lots of low cost, those hydrogen combustion turbines and other types of low cost, much lower cost generation than down here, and you have more ways to move it there. And some of that's the story in intra-regional. It's just a little less connectivity, as you noticed, Jeff.
And Travis, do you have to leave at 2?
I can stay a little longer. Checking my calendar. I think I'm okay until 2:30.
Okay.
You have a closer question that I'd like to ask at the end if there's time, just to plant that, Sarah, if it's possible.
Yeah, I had a quick question, and also, if you can stay, if anyone else wants to stay past 2 for a couple more minutes, if you have questions. What are the assumptions in the study with who is purchasing the power from the offshore wind developers, and how does that whole, concept of power purchase agreements and the utilities play into how, like, I think Jeff's question was kind of getting at like the idea that the ratepayers are also a factor here, and how transmission could affect that. So yeah, that was a big question, but I'm just curious about what those assumptions are.
Yeah, and that's an insightful question. What I will say is so a lot of this leverages the production cost model. This production cost model we use is the one the Western Electricity Coordinating Council endorses and uses, and thereby everyone. I mean, of course, I've just told you about how we've modified it quite a bit to look at these really future systems, but we start with that production cost model, and it is called the anchor data set. So if you wanted to read more about that, the anchor data set is something where Portland General Electric or PG&E or Seattle City Light, they all submit what they are planning on their system, both from a generation and transmission perspective. And that becomes the model which we run a least cost dispatch on. What is missing completely from that model are bilateral contracts for power trade. So you could look at it as, well, that's a major deficiency of this work. And that would be true in 2024 and 2025. I won't go too far out of my lane here and just say, these are benefits that are possible in a different world in which we have an open market. So if we see a 2050, which is completely governed by bilateral contracts, as we pretty much are today, then this is not possible. And to the the way we've modeled is not consistent with that world. Does that make sense, Sarah?
Yeah, yeah.
That's pretty important to distinguish that. Yeah. And that is, I should have probably mentioned that to the script at the beginning. Like that is kind of fundamental to our work. Large market construct, trading in power as it would be most economically advantageous.
Yeah. Yeah, Jeff.
So as we're kind of at time, I guess I'd like to bring this down to earth a little bit and look at where we are at the moment, which is an uncertain future with whether offshore wind happens, and if it does, the rate at which it happens. And this, as a starting assumption, assumes that there will be 15 gigawatts in Oregon relatively quickly, which doesn't, at this
On the West
point,
Coast, yeah. Not just
oh,
in
I'm
Oregon.
sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Just 2 gigawatts in Oregon in 2035.
Just 2 gigawatts. Thank you. Okay. So I guess if that future doesn't happen or is late, are there things that we can learn, or if Oregon ends up with just less total in the future,
Mm-hmm.
is there something we can pull out of this study that helps us understand? And I've used this before, like what are the no-brainer investments in transmission? If you're saying connecting Oregon, California only really adds value if you're also doing offshore wind, or if the onshore stuff never materializes, like what can we pull out of this to say, this is the clear direction we need to go now, even if we don't know where things are going to go 20 years from now?
Yeah. It's a great question. You've asked it before, Jeff. It's a good one. It's a really good one. I'm glad you asked stuff like that. I have to be careful because I'm supposed to talk about what I did. But I'll just point to this. Just a reminder. I didn't show you a plot here without offshore wind in it, right? So offshore wind generation is part of this net present value stack. But you did see, maybe you can connect some dots and say, oh gosh, he showed me a generation mix, which is really dominated by not offshore wind, right? There's a ton of contributions here, which, okay, say offshore wind wasn't part of the stack, so you lose the dark blue bar, but you still have, the better part of 450 gigawatts of generation. That 450 gigawatts of generation could still give you many of these things that are in this bar. Not the gray, because the gray requires generators to be able to be redispatched. So probably that would not, I haven't thought about that, but that might not be really there anymore. But in terms of saving costs through lower cost generation, offshore wind is not a big part of that story. And I didn't really show you a plot to show you that. You kind of have to trust me a little bit from doing the work, but it's some of these transmission brings many benefits and many types of benefits. One of the types could be just moving power better and having lower cost generation. Another option could be resource adequacy, but that depends on how much we build out the onshore system. And I showed you that if we really build it out, there's not much resource adequacy value. But those are like I would say the macro kind of answers to your question. Like some of this still holds even without offshore wind. We also found, I just have to mention that we did find when we were combing through the transmission system, and this isn't in the report, but between Crescent City and Brookings, there's no link. Crescent City is a place that gets isolated pretty easily. They run on diesel power. One could link Brookings and Crescent City, and potentially, I know PacWest is talking about an extension of the transmission system into Crescent City with a 500 kV build into Grants Pass. So then you've got like a way to loop power to some of these communities out of the coast, including Brookings. Brookings is on a long radial line. If they lose power from Coos Bay, they're host. They have no way, there's no like back channel to bring them electricity. So I would say things like that, where there are little pockets, and it's hard to pick up here, but that's what this line is here. Like there's actual plans. Pacific Core is already thinking about how do we build into Crescent City to give them more power reliability. And then I would say one no-brainer would be to connect, like do a loop here. And there was a Northern Grid study that you may be familiar with. Chelsea Loomis ran it a few years ago. Dmitry Kosterov at Bono was an advisor. I was as well, and they considered this like this idea of kind of looping between Wenzin and Fairview as well. So finding ways to like provide alternate paths for power to flow to coastal communities.
Thank you. I have to admit though, Travis, I'm confused because what I thought your final conclusion was that if you just build the transmission without the offshore wind, your savings are not what you thought they were. But then I thought I just heard you say that offshore wind is such a small contribution to the stack that if you build the transmission, you still get that big green bar of value.
Yeah, it's a nuanced point. I'll try again. It's complicated, but what I'll say is this is what Sarah was asking about. This last finding pertains just to resource adequacy. So just in those times in which, California is out of resources, they've done flex alerts. They have, they've asked everybody to stop consuming power. They don't have any more solar generation on their system. They're out of options. They need help from other people, from other regions. What's surprising, offshore wind does provide capacity. Like if in a world in which California doesn't have that today, when they bring in offshore wind, they're going to see a benefit in that way to those kind of evening peaks, and that'll be very valuable. An outsized benefit beyond just the clean electricity at different times a year. But what's surprising is that more transmission didn't really help. Like bringing other resources in those key moments didn't really help. So that is a finding that would be true without offshore wind. Like that's just surprising. So in other words, there's adequate transmission onshore in these models to serve those needs, those times of significant system stress.
If we were to build the whole offshore backbone and the interconnections that were on the maps, those green bars would still largely be intact, even if there weren't turbines out there too.
I think so. Yeah. I think that the offshore wind contributions to the lower fuel savings, they're not nothing, but they are not the majority of those benefits.
But those green bars are predicated on the assumption that we build 300 gigawatts of new power from somewhere over the next 30 years.
That's true. That is true. Yes.
Okay. Got it. Okay. Wow. Thank you. This is like the third time I've seen you do this, and I think I'm finally starting to get it.
I think it's important to see it more. I mean, I've seen it, of course, many times, and that's how I can understand it. But yeah, I think it's important to ask those questions and keep burrowing. So I'm happy to take more, even if we don't have time now, folks I got to run. We could do this again if you want, Jeff and Sarah, or we could, whatever. If you guys want to have just a follow-on Q&A, happy to do that.
Maybe. I think that could be helpful. Yeah, if anyone has any last minute questions, we could take those. Otherwise, I think we can wrap up, and I'll put together these resources and the recording. And yeah, if anyone has questions for Travis or, would like a follow-up, you could send us a message and we could try to set up a follow-up Q&A. I'm definitely going to go back and look into this report and try to, put things together now that I've got the background.
Great. Yeah. I just want to thank you again for the opportunity to chat about this. I mean, this was really fun work. Definitely the highlight of my career so far. We're not doing a lot of this work right now, as you might be able to guess, but it's important that we answer questions about it and make it, kind of decipher it a bit. I think that's why Jeff and Sarah really appreciate your questions, because it's easy to kind of be in this world and not like it's no good if it just stays there. It's gotta make sense to folks, and they need to be able to pull out actionable steps from this. But yeah, I'll also acknowledge, I think I've done it a couple times, but the planners that we have in place now are doing a great job, and they were directly involved in this work. So their contingencies were modeled directly and their plans are modeled directly. So we do feel like, it's credible in that way. We think that's a strength of the study, that we've used the planning community, the people who are planning. And I also think that California ISO in particular is doing a really good job with this pathway question. They're thinking carefully about, making moves now that benefit us later, benefit them, their stakeholders later, without overly investing in something that has some risk to it. So there's some neat things in the California transmission plan that was board approved. Like several $1 billion of board approved projects. They're building transmission. They're building some of these lines right now. So they're actually going forward and doing this stuff. Yeah, some of the, like this line into Collinsville, they're building that right now. It's board approved. It's in the transmission plan. They're starting with it as an AC line, and then they're going to turn it. So this is starting as an AC line, and they have an ability. It's like a magic trick. They're going to turn that into. They have the ability in the future to use the same easement and the same towers to be able to use HVDC conductors and put much more power through that same corridor. So to me, that's an example of someone thinking outside the box, thinking through these pathways.
If we don't stop soon, I'm going to start asking more questions. So,
Do you have another question, Jeff, or you want
my
to?
God, I have so many. What are you talking about?
Julia, did you have a question?
No, I was just going to
Oh.
prompt Jeff to ask a question because I benefit every time he does.
Oh man, oh man. Well, I think one of the questions we had from one of our roundtable members was, is the total amount of offshore wind an aspiration, or is it predictive based on demand and cost? But again, I think what came out of this study that I'm really taking away is offshore wind helps with total capacity, but it's just a drop in the larger bucket. And this is really about how do we have a more interconnected system? I think for me, the lingering question is maybe a policy and values one, and one that's come up a lot with our roundtable is if we are building all this transmission infrastructure in Oregon and California and plugging a bunch of stuff into it, and it mostly benefits California, how do you think about the distribution of what it costs to Oregon in resources and space or whatever, and that value going down there? How do you even that out? What mechanisms are in place to do that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I didn't include that in the slides. We do have some material on that question in the report.
You do? Okay.
When we start disaggregating the benefits and we start to see who stands to benefit, that's a very touchy subject. So this one is loaded for sure. Can be a powder keg. It's true that California has the high rates. They have the high costs. This is something that's going to benefit California. And I know there's sensitivity to folks bearing perceived costs of generation of resources, development of the resources, sorry, and then someone else reaping the benefits. Well, what we see is that if there actually is a potential penalty if the Northwest doesn't keep up with California. If the Northwest doesn't keep up with California in the way that they are developing their transmission system, particularly in light of offshore wind, the billions of dollars I just mentioned that are board approved, that's fact, that is happening right now. There could be a world, now that would be long down the road, but there could be a world in which there's all kinds of ways to deliver. I mean, California is benefiting from this low cost power. But in times in which Oregon has needs from the south, or Washington, when the Northwest is needing power from the south, perhaps lower cost power in those winter peaks, when again, non-coincidence of peaks. So the Northwest is seeing some stress. California is not seeing stress at the same time. They have extra capacity. They could send power up. If our transmission system doesn't keep up, there could be congestion and near the border, particularly if we don't build this offshore transmission, that could impose significant costs on the Northwest ratepayer. So that's something to keep in mind. Like if California goes, like you wouldn't want to develop this, like stepping back, thinking about the system, it would not be optimal for you to develop one part of the system and not the other. Like if one part of the system has significant connectivity and the other doesn't, then you could end up with pockets of congestion, and those pockets could be big and they could be expensive. So that is a concern. I think that is a concern. It's a pretty far off concern, to be fair, Jeff. Like we have to go pretty far down this road before that really starts to become a problem. And I do think planners know that, and that was one of the warnings we issued from this report, that you really got to pay attention to what the other regions do. In California, ISO they have a charter, they have a focus on their footprint. It's really not their job to worry about the Northwest. We do not have RTOs on the West Coast. We do not have, a central planner. And that's why a Department of Energy study is useful, because people don't plan this way. We actually, like, Bonneville doesn't plan California system, California doesn't plan Bonneville system, Pacific Core doesn't plan either, so there is a gap here in the way that people are looking at the potential benefits and costs, and the way those will hit different areas geographically and different types of users as well. So we did a cost disaggregation in the study that I refer you to if you wanted to see more about that.
However, Travis, isn't there, I mean, just a greater like movement toward Western regional planning? So it's like what you just said is true. And I mean, per the whole presentation today, it's like this interesting tension around how might we think about what's possible like at the local level when we think about like protections and benefits and what have you, what happens at the state level with planning, what options and opportunities there are, and then this movement toward Western regional planning. It's I think really interesting in terms of working with communities to understand and identify like what's possible in terms of influence and benefit, especially maybe for communities that want to realize greater energy reliability as part of like the benefit stack for offshore wind development, whatever part of the cluster that is taking place in their community. So it's just fascinating, this regionalization element that I think so many of us don't go there when we're thinking about the forces at play related to our energy system and how they really work. So I've appreciated that about your presentation, is just that greater understanding.
I fully agree with your observations. I have to stick with what's published, but I would agree with you that the way we modeled in the published work, the way we modeled it was as though it was regionally operated, regionally planned. That was our approach.
Which I feel like just lends itself to painting a picture for decision makers as to why that needs to be the approach that we are exploring. I mean, I appreciate that, because it's a matter of like, what's the rational way to solve this difficult, complicated problem. I'm trying to understand why the benefits to Oregon in your mind appear so far in the future, because I feel like wildfire risk is real and highly variable, demands on our energy system for not very well, if at all, regulated data centers. You know what I mean? It's like I like why do you not see potential? I mean, it seems like the resiliency is a benefit to Oregon.
Oh, definitely.
Even if it's like, and the only reason why the cost wise it's so beneficial to California is because the crisis that we're trying to forestall against is happening in California. Their energy is expensive because this needed to be built 10, 20 years ago, right? And it's like we are trying to like get ahead of the curve in Oregon. But I'm just kind of, it seems to me like in an emergency situation, immediately the situation is better if there's connectivity and the energy to a community can come from a different sort. I mean, anyway, maybe not articulating this well. I missed half the presentation, but I'm just trying to understand why that's predicted as so far off in the future, because it seems to me like I would see short-term immediate benefits for emergency situations in Oregon.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, it's definitely true. I guess I was talking about the kind of the overall benefit disaggregation, but it's true that, I mean, well, there's no connection, I just told you, between Crescent City and Brookings, but smaller communities in Oregon definitely will see would see a power benefit. Let's say it that way. They will see a power reliability benefit and a diversification of power supply, and they'll see and there will be reversal of power flows across the coast range that is beneficial in terms of just less congestion and another, like there are some power quality benefits from having a generator at the coast. We don't have any generators at the coast, really.
Yeah.
There's not much there. So that is one of the benefits to a local community, I think.
And I think that's politically valuable. Like there are,
Yeah,
like,
it would
I think the way that decisions are made in Oregon are often about actually what is best for these communities. Like that matters. I don't think it's just this bottom line brass tacks kind of situation when it comes to these things. So sorry, I know I always think about things in a political sense. I'm hoping this is not inappropriate for
Yeah.
this setting, but it's just like I feel like where this information is going to be relevant and like so I think that there's a way to frame it as beneficial, even if it's not this like pure dollars to dollars thing. But anyway, sorry, someone else had their hand up, or Jeff had a question in the chat.
Yeah. Well, I just want to take what you're saying and ask, can this value that you're describing, the coast has greater reliability of its power and it's more resilient to shocks. Can that be quantified? And has it been quantified so that we can actually get our arms around it more than just saying it conceptually?
Yeah. So I have to stick to the published work, Jeff. I'm sorry, but
point me to any other bubbles.
it is being quantified. I'm just not sure when we'll be able to publish it in this environment, and we have to stick with published. And so yeah, I'm sorry. I wish I could say more, but I have to talk about the work that was published. And your question is right on the money. It can be quantified. There was work to quantify it, and work is ongoing at the laboratory and other places to do that. But it's not in the report that I'm reviewing for you today.
Well, I'll just let you know one of the recommendations in the draft roadmap is to better quantify that system value that comes from that in one way or another.
Katie Arkaba on my team here, who is part of this, she's another researcher at PNNL and is also a joint faculty member at University of Washington. She led that part of the work, and so I would watch for her work. It's likely if that work goes out, it'll be like in a peer-reviewed article. It won't be a Department of Energy report. We don't think. I mean, the Department of Energy could change their mind, but I don't anticipate that to happen. So I would just flag that for you. I'm not going to speak to that work right now, so I don't get myself in trouble. But I will say Katie's doing a great job, and her whole team, and they will be seeking to put work out in peer-reviewed literature, which we do as a lab, and that's something we get to hold on to as scientists and researchers. But thanks for the questions. They're really, yes, it is a good published source. Yeah. But yeah, if there's questions about when you look in the report, I mean, we are this disaggregation of the overall benefit stack is what I'm referring to. So this is like macro, zooming out, like looking at the whole West Coast. If you zoomed in or you drew the fence around a community or looked at it slightly differently, you could find different things. And definitely there are other attributes that are beneficial to Oregonians and Washingtonians up in Zets up there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for staying on a little bit longer and answering all these questions.
Of course. Of course. Yeah,
that half hour went fast.
I love the questions. I mean, it really is. Like, I do mean it. I mean, I just think it's great. You really informed audience. Thank you so much for digging in, all of you. I appreciate it. I'm happy to answer questions any other time within the constraints I have to operate in right now.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I think this all gave us really great insight for the roadmap and just that regional consideration.
All right. Thanks. Well, have a great afternoon, all.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.